Hello?
All right, Eric, can you hear us?
Yeah, loud and clear.
All right, I sent you a chat. Can you check that out real quick?
I've just replied to you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's call the meeting to order at 6:02 p.m. Natalie, may we have roll call, please?
Chairperson Phil Goldstein,
Here.
Vice Chairperson Marty Jost,
Here.
Commissioner Lisa Baird. Here. Commissioner Eric Westland,
Here.
Commissioner Tom Wood,
Here.
alternate Jeremy Holt, alternate Wendy Newland.
Thanks. Looks like the little Wi-Fi symbol. Amendments to the agenda. This is sort of an amendment to the agenda. We have a rather unusual situation tonight. We have Marty joining us from Mumbai in India, and I'm glad he is. I will tell you, we have a very complicated subject tonight, and I know he's had because I looked it up right before the meeting, 19 and a quarter hours of flying time. So I'm sure he had plenty of time to read our subject material and will be his usual glib self. Unfortunately, we also have Eric Westland is on with us out of deference to the fact that he's traveling and he's changed jobs. You still there, Eric?
I am. Yep.
And it's very disappointing personally to me and to you as colleagues that unfortunately, because of his job obligations, this will be the last meeting for Eric. We were hoping that we would have some recourse that would prevent that because he's been a very valuable member for the relatively brief time he's been on. But Eric, I'm glad you're joining us tonight, and I'll give you an opportunity at the end if there's any thoughts that you have here in addition to anything else that hopefully you want to offer on the subject material.
Appreciate that, Phil, and happy to be on the call tonight. Thanks.
Okay. Determination of alternate voting, that is moot because we have, and staff, am I correct? Marty and Eric can vote. Okay. And we have no buddy here for open public comment. So we open and close. I assume we're following the normal procedural. So we open and close the general public comment, which is an opportunity for anybody who wants to speak on something that's not on the agenda. We've opened and closed that. Consent agenda, commissioners, consists of the only approval of the July 19th, 2022 meeting minutes. Commissioners, any additions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none. Marty, Eric, anything from your end?
Nope. Nothing for me.
Nothing, either of you. Okay. With that, do I have a motion on the consent agenda? Some move to accept the consent agenda. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second. Was that Eric?
That was Marty.
Marty. Okay. All right. All in favor of the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Consent agenda passes on a 5-0 vote. Business item, we have one item tonight, item 6A, land use code amendment number 12. And I will turn it over to Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. As you mentioned,
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
You're good.
One thing I should have mentioned, you'll probably do this anyway. If you can't, with all the amazing electronic gizmos you got, show some of these changes.
Yep, we will.
Side by side, you can. Great. I had a
Yep.
feeling you would.
Yep, Chad down there's got some exhibits to show you.
Fantastic. You're one step ahead of me.
So as you mentioned, this is a land use code amendment. We had mentioned, I believe we'd mentioned kind of in the earlier this year, we're going to start kind of bringing 2 amendments a year, kind of one towards the middle, one at the beginning of the year. If necessary, this is kind of our mid-year update that we're kind of bringing forward with some changes. Generally, the changes that we're proposing tonight are basically changing things within child care home, wind energy, open space requirements, dimensional standards, and then buffer yard requirements. Chairperson, not quite sure how you want me to go through, if you want me to just kind of hit the highlights on each one first, or if we want to kind of first open it to questions that you guys have. I'm happy to go either direction that you all see fit.
I'd say hit the highlights. Commissioners, you okay with that?
So,
and then we'll circle back to anything.
Yep, perfect.
And Marty and Eric, you'll just have to jump in whenever you have a question and interrupt. if necessary. Thanks.
So the first change is in relation to child care homes. This is actually more of a requirement that we have to do. Back in last year, in 2021, the state of Colorado actually passed House Bill 22 or 21-1222, and this was geared towards the regulation of child care facilities, in-home child care facilities specifically, and the fact that there is a shortage of those facilities statewide, and the state had found that there were a lot of the reason for the shortages were municipal regulations on them that kind of hindered their ability to operate. So the state passed the House bill that actually made it easier and more accessible for in-home childcare. That actually kind of took away some regulations from municipalities. So in this regard, we took away the requirement that they have to have an inspection done by Appendix M of the IRC. And then the main one that we also took away is the occupancy limit, and then the the number of in-home childcare homes within a subdivision. We had regulations on there could be a certain amount per single or COs within a subdivision, and then the amount of trips per day were removed. So the state basically kind of said we can't do any other regulations that we couldn't do, that we don't impose on just general single family residences on childcare. So that's why we are removing these sections, because they go above and beyond requirements that a regular single family residence wouldn't have to necessarily meet. So that is generally the changes that we have towards in-home child cares. The next one that we have is towards accessory buildings and accessory uses. What we added in was a section about basically wind energy, a structure that captures wind energy. This is becoming a more popular thing that residents want to use to kind of offset their energy costs. We don't have any requirements right now. This was actually another, there was actually another state bill that was passed this year that prohibited metro districts and HOAs from precluding these within a subdivision. So any subdivision in Timnath is eligible, or any resident in a Timnath neighborhood is eligible for putting up a wind turbine. That is a state law now. So from that, we put in some regulations about where these wind turbines could be essentially located on a property. So we've added in some dimensional standards for location, and then kind of color, and then the decibels that they give off when they are rotating, producing that energy. So that's the next item that we have added in. So then the next topic is on open space requirements. So we have added in a section on regional commercial and community commercial zoning. We've added in a section about shared parking. If a development is sharing parking, they can reduce the open space requirement from 25% to 20%. From that standpoint, this was this was something that staff has requested, just because when we're talking on larger commercial developments, we want to have more connectivity between users and lots, instead of having individual lots one by one, kind of as you see over there at Chick-fil-A, Starbucks, and Murphy. None of those actually are, accessible between each other, just because they had to meet open space requirements and things like that. So if we have a development that comes in that utilizes shared parking and connectivity, they're eligible for a reduction in open space. The next one that we
Kevin,
did.
excuse me, I'm sorry. Despite what I said initially, why don't we pause right here?
Yep, we can pause.
Certainly, in my age, I'll never remember to circle back. Why don't
I'll
we
say,
pause?
let me finish off on open space and then
Okay.
we can go with questions if that's
Okay.
all right, Phil.
All right.
So then the next change that we did was for neighborhood, commercial, and industrial. We've actually increased the minimum open space from 15% to 20, but then also with a kind of the same caveat that if they are using shared parking connectivity, they could actually stay at the 15%. And then for commercial mixed use, residential mixed use, and business, we removed the section that said it was 5% open space that they would have to provide. And then we've added it in as 25% for if the primary use is residential in one of those districts, zoning districts, they have to have 25% use open space with half of that being usable open space. And then for developments that are primarily commercial, we've increased that to be 20% open space that they have to provide. And then for the commercial, there's the same caveat that if it's shared parking and connectivity, they could reduce from 20 to 15%. So with that,
Perfect.
we
Good.
can go with
Okay,
questions.
good. I'm sorry. I thought
No,
we
you're
were at
good.
the end of the pay. Okay, let's do this since we can't see Eric and Marty. Let's see first on these items that we've covered. Marty, why don't you go first, since I know you read all this over on that lengthy flight. Why don't you go first with any questions that you have?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so first question is about these two, just a general question that I get the state passed this and we have to change it to so we're not unreasonably restricted, I think the wording was, but I'm just wondering how this plays with HOAs. Do we have to do anything to ensure that the HOAs aren't being unreasonably restrictive, or is that between the HOA and the state?
That would most likely be between the HOA and the state, since the HOA or a metro district is also a governmental agency. They would most likely have to fall under these rules as well. But currently, all of our metro districts actually don't disallow for an in-home. Are you referring to the care home or the wind turbines, Marty?
Well, either,
Yeah.
because for example, I think there's HOA rules that I've seen
Yep.
that do get into the number of trips or the number of cars that can be out front and things like that.
Yep. So for the childcare, the metro district or HOA would still, from our interpretation, have to abide by the House bill rules since it is a state law, and
Okay.
a metro district is governmental. As far as wind turbines, the House bill actually specifically calls out special districts that they can't not allow wind turbines.
Okay. All right, thanks. So I was just making sure that we don't have to put anything in here that's between the HOA and the state. The other one wasn't a change, but just got my attention. 4.4.8.2 define, it says, it gets into fences, and just wondering if that should be further defined, because it basically just says minimum of 4 foot height. I'm assuming, shouldn't that be a privacy fence and not like a split rail? Or is that not a big deal?
From our standpoint, we kind of left the type of fence up to the individual user. The state will most likely, since the state regulates the home and does inspections, the state would probably come in and actually require a different change as long as they have a 4-foot wall and meet our fencing criteria. That's all we were going with this time that we added that in a couple amendments ago.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And then the couple things on the buffer, or what we were going through just a minute ago, is I guess the thing I was trying to understand in that one was, I get that if they have shared parking, they can do a 5% reduction, but is there a minimum number of shared parking that they have to do to be able to get that reduction? so can somebody just add one shared parking spot and get a 5% reduction?
So we do in the code for parking, we do have a shared parking section that basically to do shared parking, the development actually has to come forward with basically a shared parking plan, and they can get a share or reduction in parking up to 20% that's then shared. That's part of the land use code right now. So it's part of a plan that they would have to kind of put together and give justification for. So the shared parking would still have to come forward because they would most likely do a reduction and kind of go through that standpoint. So yeah, and Matt's going to jump in, but yeah, there is code section about shared parking and providing justification for it.
All right, that's what I was wondering is there's another set of rules that they would need to go by in order to earn that 5%. So that's good. That's all the questions I had on these two sections.
Oh, I do want to add something, Marty, to that
Okay.
particular comment that you just made. We also wrote it in a way that it says the incentive may be granted. So it's not it's not a given that you're going to get the incentive, and it has there's a staff discretion too. So to your first point, even if it's one parking space, the staff has the ability to say, this, you're not meeting the spirit or the intent of this. So we have flexibility. So we built it that way intentionally, and we knew that we actually tested it a little bit to say, what if they did come with one? Do they get 5%? No, that's not where we would be. The other thing to keep in mind, which it's a little interesting, is so if you share parking spaces, you hypothetically reduce the number of parking spaces, correct? So you have hypothetically now a smaller parking lot. You still have the same size buildings. So you're ending up, even though you can maybe reduce your open space, you're going to actually end up potentially with more open space because it's a residual of there's three legs to this. One is the building, one's the parking, one's open space. So those three legs, each one of them, if one gets bigger or smaller, the other one has to reflectively get bigger or smaller. So in the case of reducing the number of parking spaces amongst two things, you're hypothetically increasing the open space potential. So we think it's going to actually kind of work it backwards into our favor to a degree. However, the other variable would be is that they can make the lots a little bit smaller. So you then back into less of an open space that way. Either any of the options, what we ultimately came to as our staff recommendation is what Kevin said was by sharing parking, we think that's actually a better use on a commercial setting because you're interconnecting people, you're reducing the number of trips that people potentially have to take because they park in one place and maybe visit two different things in lieu of trying to create little strips of grass or landscape between these two things. So I think so from a staff perspective, that was our motivating factor for giving this inch of open space reduction in favor of creating a safer, more connected development.
Probably a bit safer for the pedestrians as well, not having to walk through a ditch or rocks and things like that. So, okay, thank you.
Yep. Eric?
Nothing further from me, Phil. Marty's covered my concerns.
All right, commissioners, let me start with Jeremy.
Yeah, so I mean, on the open space, I'm assuming thought is, you bring up the Starbucks, Murphy, right, Chick-fil-A. Do you see a improvement, or as part of this due to like an improvement in traffic flow? So you don't have to essentially put as many stop signs and stop traffic to then have turns, the whole 9 yards. I mean, I'm assuming that's probably part of the eliminating more open space and connectivity in the parking lot. Is that the whole goal?
I mean, the elimination of stop signs, it wasn't geared towards that, but that is a benefit that would happen. As Matt had mentioned, it's so if like you take the Murphy, Chick-fil-A, Starbucks, scenario, if somebody goes to, they're on a road trip, they need to get gas, they stop at Murphy. Typically that person's, if they want coffee, they've got to, as Marty had also mentioned, they've got to kind of navigate rocks, landscaping, other things to then get over to Starbucks for coffee. If those two sites were interconnected by shared parking, open drives between each other, that somebody can park, pedestrians can easily walk over, or even at that point when somebody's done, filling up gas and it's now I need to go over and pick up somebody from Starbucks, they can just, drive over, get into one of the spots instead of having to navigate getting out of the lot, getting onto the internal drive, getting back into Starbucks just to go 30 feet.
Makes sense. And then my other question back to the wind turbine. You'd mentioned color, noise.
Mhm.
I'm assuming size plays a factor in that too.
So the House bill in relation to that, actually, it prohibits restrictions that would increase cost of the unit by 10% or decrease efficiency by 10%. So there's really not a regulation on the size of the unit from that standpoint, because our interpretation was if we start to hinder the size of it, we potentially get into that gray area of have we increased cost or have we decreased the efficiency of a unit.
Okay. So there's parameters put in that
Yep.
ultimately will dictate size at the end of the day. Yeah.
And then Chad's got one more.
Yeah, and also in that House bill, it does provide an area for bona fide safety requirements. So that's kind of where we came with the fall distance. So not necessarily restricting the height itself, just as is the structure, but based on the lot size and surrounding structures to ensure that not only the lot itself and structures were safe if that were to fall. It also would create some help to that neighbor just in case. So it would never reach that property line based on this language due to how we wrote that in there.
Anything else? Lisa?
Let's see. On
Hey, Lisa, can you get your mic on?
relative to the wind turbine, is there anything that needs to be regulated on the turbine movement itself? I mean, I'm not familiar with backyard, wind turbines, but the movement itself of the turbine can be, I would think it would be problematic towards other residences.
Are you like referring to noise or?
Noise or even aesthetics
Yep.
or wildlife or anything
So
like that.
that's, we have in there, one of the conditions
noise
is
thing.
the noise 10 decibels. Color we have as well from that standpoint. It's typically most of these you won't see be like larger wind turbines that you might see commercially.
Right.
From that standpoint, the House bill kind of leaves things a little bit vague as to what we can really require and not require from that standpoint. It's just these are going to be kind of more common to where the best we can do is, get certain locations, as Chad had mentioned, for the lot for fall zone, if something does go wrong, color, and then decibels to try and limit that impact on your neighbor. From that standpoint, a lot of these also aren't the normal wind turbines that you see that have the three prongs. A lot of them are kind of cylindrical that we've seen, so that they actually they don't take up as much of a wingspan, I'll call it that. But that doesn't the House bill doesn't refer to the type of it. So it's still up to the individual homeowner what they want to do. But yeah, a lot of the more residential is a more cylindrical type. That could limit the impact to wildlife.
Okay. So given number one that says the fall is going to be this, how tall are we thinking this is going to be?
That all varies depending on the size of your lot. If I would say if you're up in Wild Wing to where you've got an acre lot, to where you've got a lot of space in your backyard, you could have one upwards of 30 to 40 feet. If you're in a smaller lot, just to meet the fall parameters, you could be talking 15 feet. So that all depends on the size of the lot that you have.
Yeah,
And these are also for standalone that we're talking about with this. There are also actual like roof mounted wind turbines that are out there as well, but these ones are specifically kind of geared towards the standalone wind turbines that would generally be on larger lot, acre size kind of lots that we would see.
the House bill doesn't go beyond just these basics. And
Correct.
So you're trying to match that versus,
Correct.
I mean, I just see as this thing, as more people try and go that route, there's going to be lots of discussions, shall we say, about
Yes.
your turbine blocks my view and it's
Yep.
unnecessary. I mean, I just see that being
Correct.
Hey,
I mean,
guys, Marty and I are having a really hard time hearing Lisa. Very faint.
sorry. I tend to talk softer. Sorry. I was just
Thank
mainly questioning, how that's going to affect people who want to put those things up and what they are going to do as far as objecting to their neighbors putting up something that's a 40-foot, even if it's in an acre lot.
Yep.
That's a large structure. So,
It is.
but it's nothing you can do at this time.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is that since the House bill does state that, a Metro District HOA cannot restrict these, we kind of, with some parameters, we felt we at least needed to kind of get ahead of it with some type of regulation to prohibit, or not prohibit, but to give regulation to how these things would be, location, color, things like that. Which the House bill says we are able to do from that standpoint. Because without having any type of regulation now, we're kind of in a little bit more of a limbo than we would be if we actually had regulations.
Toward that end and toward Lisa's point, though, if there is certain amount of subjectivity, is there not at least a reasonable consultation with neighbors to say there are certain things where you may have a say in this, certain things you may not, and at least temper the disappointment, because virtually nobody's going to know that they buy a house and the guy next door can right next to the property line can put a wind turbine up. So is there not a possibility of some kind of consultation, not to restrict it entirely, but to maybe give them a little bit of say in the matter?
You may elicit their input, but they cannot in any way, you can still go forward with or without their comments. So
Yeah.
It would be almost like you move in and your neighbor wants to paint their house bright pink.
And the reality is that the House bill, the two places where they're like the 10% cost and the 10% efficiency, by anything that we really regulate, the argument could be made, well, you're impacting me by 10%. And so they could challenge. That's why our recommendation is very specific to what Chad mentioned earlier. It's got to be a safety issue, what we can regulate to. So this fall zone thing that Kevin was talking about, that's safety. So if it falls and it lands in the neighbor's yard and it hurts somebody, that's an issue. If it falls and it lands in your yard and it's not hitting anything, then you're good to go. So that's why we kind of focused in on safety. And then it gave us a little bit of latitude on the color thing, because that's not going to, you change the color of it, it's not going to appreciably change the cost. So we focused in on that. So we tried to be very pinpointed on what wasn't going to get the town in trouble potentially if it got challenged. And so we try to give those, as soon as we put something that gives the neighbor an opportunity to make a statement, or gives, there's places where we will get challenged and we won't be successful because we've moved ourselves outside of the parameters that they've given. That's why just a caution to that whole thing.
My other question too, back to Phil's point on the property line, is there a restriction that could be put on overhang, right? Lisa brought it up earlier, the rotation of it. Some of these might be the tri-blade, some of them might be the smaller blade, but can you limit overhang into somebody else's property line, where that is affecting, potential tree growth or plants or, anything along those lines, especially if they're going to be at that 12 to 15 foot range. Somebody wants to put landscaping now, they can't because a turbine's overhanging in someone's yard.
How's that?
Okay.
So the wording is, you actually can't even be, so let's say you've got a 10 foot, you have to be 10 foot plus 5 additional feet from the property line. So if it's a 10 foot tall turbine, it's got to be 15 feet from the property line. So it's built automatically into
Okay.
that. So we won't ever get a situation where it's right up against the property line unless the thing's 5 feet, less than 5 feet tall, or less than an inch tall. There's a certain height. You've got 5 feet automatic, but that's as if the thing was on the ground. And if you make it a foot taller, you've got to be 6 feet. If you make it 2 feet taller, you're 7 feet. If you make it 3 feet taller, you're 8 feet. So you're just adding, however tall you're making it, it's going up 5 feet plus whatever the height of it is. So it's never going to get right up to the property line. And just so that is built into that number one comment.
No, perfectly fine. That also takes into consideration open space too. So like if you back to a green belt, even though there's not a house behind you, does that 5 foot parameter still match into open space too? Okay.
Yep.
All right, back to Lisa.
On
Questions?
the shared parking on those open space requirements, when you're under the shared parking plans, you don't have to have one continual parking area. You can have shared connectivity with either a driveway or a drive-through or a walkway or something like that, correct?
So
Or are you having one, like using the Chick-fil-A Starbucks as an example? Is it just one big old long
So
strip?
if like the Chick-fil-A Starbucks in that area was kind of how the development across the street is where Backyard Bird Domino's is. In the instance where there was a giant shared parking lot for, some multiple users, there would still be connectivity between by drive aisles. But if it's just a singular drive aisle, that's where the staff discretion would come in, because if they're trying to use a singular drive aisle that says, this building is, 100 feet away from this parking, but these people are going to use it, but only by this one drive aisle, that's where staff would have to review that to see if that's a valid request or not. Typically, what we would be looking for is a situation like across the street to where there's multiple users sharing one larger parking lot, that's what kind of is gearing more towards the sharing of that parking, because truly you can park in that parking lot and go to 8 different users that are there.
Okay. And then on all of the home care ones, lots of removals, which I think is good because I think you can be overregulated on stuff. Was there anything, all of those were designed to meet the state that
Correct.
they felt were overregulated. So it's just
Yes.
basically removing those barriers to make it easier.
Correct. This was the removal of the certain sections in there was to actually be in line with the state. There wasn't any additional removals or changes. Otherwise, it was more in line to be with what the state requirements were.
Okay. I believe those were all my questions.
Tom, next.
Yeah, I've got a couple questions. Currently, is it required to have a building permit to get a windmill, a wind turbine in the backyard?
It would be an accessory structure, so yes.
Because I know a lot of people have chimes and whirligigs and all things that are wind moved, and certainly they make more than 10 decibel noises. But I'm not on the impression that that's required to have a building permit.
No, this is geared towards actual wind turbines, not wind chimes or something you hang up on your back patio.
So that if somebody wants to do that, they'll have to go through a permit process and inspection. Presumably there'll be foundation requirements and everything else.
Yep.
Okay. And then a question on the shared parking. It talks about commercial and industrial developments. Is it intended for residential or like apartments and those kinds of things?
No, this is specifically towards industrial. So that's where the last one on the RMU, CMU, and then business, it talks about 2 different, if the primary is residential or if the primary is commercial.
Okay.
So we have built into those, because the industrial and neighborhood commercial don't have, residential or multifamily to it. But the, RMU, CMU, which have the ability to have a residential component, that's where we have the difference between those 2.
Okay, great. And then on the childcare, there's other regulations associated with elder care and group homes and so forth. Do any of these changes affect those kinds of things?
So this is specifically for in-home childcare that these regulations are. These have nothing to do with elder care or, memory care facilities. This is specifically towards in-home childcare.
In a previous neighborhood I lived in, we had a house that became an elder care facility, and it started as a child care, and they kind of moved to adult care, and initially that was okay under the child care things, but then when it went beyond that, where they stayed overnight, and it became a group home for handicapped individuals, and then a halfway house, it morphed over time, and I just want to make sure we're being
We
protected.
have other sections in the code that talk about other care homes, group homes, specifically, some of those, but this section here is specifically just for in-home child care facilities. Yeah, we do have other sections that talk about those types of homes and uses,
Right.
that we have other regulations on, but yeah, this is only for child care.
Because some of those state regulations are contradictory and confusing in
Yep.
terms of distance between what you can and can't have and what happens when it changes.
Yep.
And the HOA got in a real fight over some of that in the previous neighborhood.
Yep.
And then one last question. I saw at the top of the childcare thing, no childcare centers facing Harmony Corridor. We had a discussion about that previously. We're not changing anything.
No, this is for specifically in-home care, not a standalone child care facility.
Yeah, I just remember we had
Yep.
that debate about Harmony facing
Yep.
childcare before. That's all the questions I have.
Thanks, Tom. Wendy?
Yep, I have 2 questions. Can you hear me? The first one, are there any of these wind turbines in Timnath right now?
No, but we have been getting inquiries from some, which has kind of also spurred the reason for kind of jumping on putting in regulations at this time. So there's none that we have currently in town, but yes, we have been getting some inquiries.
And so they can put them anywhere they want, front yard, backyard?
So typically we see these in rear yards from that standpoint. I believe the safety aspect would still come into play, especially because we have that first section that talks about the distance to right-of-ways, structures, things like that. But typically these would be in rear yards.
And then a question about the color.
Yep.
So if you could move to that color area, so it's cream, neutrals, this kind of thing, but nothing about decorating them, like Nebraska Cornhusker. I mean, I can just see that kind of.
Flashing lights and everything.
Yeah, I would say if they want to paint it like Nebraska Cornhusker, that still wouldn't meet
On
the
top of the
it
cream.
wouldn't meet because it would have red, not the neutral beige, taupe gray.
Whole
cream.
thing has
Yep.
to be that color.
Yep.
Okay.
I am confused about, I was under the impression, and unfortunately, I've been an HOA officer longer than I care to mention. So this goes back quite a ways to a previous neighborhood in Fort Collins. I was under the impression that a master association, an HOA, could be more restrictive on certain things.
They can, but this House bill actually takes that restrictiveness away. The House bill specifically states that a HOA or district cannot prohibit these types of uses.
Can they, for instance, and there were some nuances to this. For instance, you couldn't prohibit a satellite dish, but you could specify that it be placed in as innocuous a place as possible, given the need to point whatever direction.
Yep.
So can the HOA have any say in this? Can't prohibit, but can it say, for instance, that I think to Wendy's question, that it can't be in the front yard?
So these regulations that we've put in are actually what the House bill says that an HOA or metro district cannot do. So pretty much we're taking the same regulations that a metro district or HOA would also be bound to, is what we're doing with this. So the metro district, like the color, the decibels, the location, this is all that a metro district would only be allowed to do. And that's why we're bringing in the same requirements that they are allowed to do. So in a sense, in other ways, yes, a metro district or HOA is more restrictive, but the state has effectively taken away a lot of that restrictiveness with this type of use specifically.
We could have flagpoles with wind turbines on them, right?
Yeah, thanks. I'm
Say go Huskers.
hoping none of my HOA members are watching right now, if you're out there. Okay, Marty, Eric, do we need to circle back to you on anything that you heard here before Kevin goes on?
No, nothing for me.
Okay.
All right. So the next two, which I would say is kind of also some bigger ones. So the next ones that we are changing are in relation to the dimensional standard table. So one thing that we are cleaning up in the dimensional standard table is lot frontages for R3 and R4 for attached single family, so townhomes versus multifamily. We didn't really have a regulation in on that, so we're adding that in. We have also changed the asterisks to numbers, so just a minor little change there to make things easier. Instead of having 5 or 6 asterisks, we can just use the numerical system to change that. Then the next thing that we've done, which is going to tie into the next thing of buffer yards, is we in the dimensional standard table, we had requirements of certain side yard, rear yard, side yard and rear yard setbacks for certain zoning districts, from basically any of the commercial and then industrial, if they were adjacent to different zonings. So what we actually found is that those were not in line with what our current buffer yard requirements were. So what we've done is we've actually removed those from the specific distance from the dimensional standard table, with adding in the footnote of footnote 5, which is to refer to the buffer yard requirements. So then what that does is we've actually changed our table 5.5 of buffer yard requirements, because it was a little confusing with how it was done in that table of proposed zoning to existing zoning, with how that was written. So what we've done is we've then kind of modified that to be an entire table of all of our zoning districts compared to each other. But then we also actually changed our buffer yard requirements as we've kind of gone through with changing in landscaping standards, seeing how developments have actually played out. We have now offered different buffer yard requirements between some developments. So those will range from buffer yard 10 or none, depending on, uses being compatible with each other, an RE next to an R2, or, an R3 next to an R3, or R3 next to a, R2. If a use is generally compatible, there's no requirement. But then we get from buffer yard 10 all the way up to 60, and the 10 up to 60 actually has a numerical significance as well, because the 10 is a 10-foot buffer, 20 foot, and so on. What we did, and what Chad has actually shown up on the screen, is we've changed the planting requirements and actually offered two options for the planting requirements within each buffer yard distance that a development can do. So if we've got a development that is required to have a buffer yard 20, let's call it, there are 2 options that a developer can pick through. One is more of more trees, but are more of an ornamental and shade tree option, or there are a little bit less tree requirement with having more shade tree, but then evergreen trees to provide more screening. It just kind of gives some flexibility with the design of a buffer yard. to an adjacent development that we kind of really didn't have before, because we more or less had specific spacing, triangular, and then actually the linear length of the buffer yard was different between each buffer yard as well. So we've cleaned that up to have the same length as 100 feet. So this actually kind of changes a lot of our buffer yard requirements from the planting. If a developer wants to go with the planting option that has more of the evergreen style trees for more shade, we do have planting bed requirements that are needed for that. So with this, we've just kind of really enhanced our buffer yard requirements that would be needed between some potential developments. And then just real quick before we open this up to questions, I will say one thing that staff actually realized today, and we're going to ask that you as Planning Commission make a condition or add in is there's no real language in the land use code for a development adjacent to a county development buffer yard requirements to that. So we just ask that you add in a note that we can add in a statement of buffer yard from a town development to a county development, because right now there is no requirement just because a county development isn't within the town. So a certain development doesn't necessarily have to meet a buffer yard requirement to a county, but we would at least like to have some type of buffer requirement in there, and that's not in this right now.
Before we open this up, while I think about it, this would be, I believe those of you who were on board at that time, the development north of Fisher.
Yep. Willis. Yep. This would be. Yeah. This would be a prime example of adding in a buffer yard requirement for
without
a development
going too
like
far and explaining this. This is a business park.
Yep.
This has a long way to go before it really starts working its way through the system in phases. And we were very clear with the residents in Homestead Estates, I believe it's called,
Correct.
Which is county.
Correct.
And will probably remain county. Again, it was not binding because we can't bind our successors, nor can council bind their successors. But we did make a comment to them, if not an outright promise, that we would do what we could to see that there was as much buffering as there could be, which was very well received. I might add, they were very pleased with what staff and commission and council did. So this would be huge, right, Kevin?
This would actually be, if what I just had mentioned would add in more teeth to require buffering from town property, town development to a county development. We don't have that exact language. We're asking that you make a recommendation that we add in language for buffering to county development.
Okay, so when we're going to vote on this tonight.
When we get to that point,
we'll circle back to this, and I'll ask that you phrase it. Thank you. Shall I open this one up now? Okay, let's go back around the same way we did. Marty?
The only thing I have, I think there may be a typo here. On page 26 of the packet, 5.7.7.3.f. I think that's supposed to read buffer 60, right? Because there's two buffer 50s. So I think that one is 60.
Yep, that is a typo. Thanks, Marty.
That's all I had.
Lisa caught that too. I could tell she was agreeing with you. Eric?
I really like this change. I think it gives your landscape architects some more ability to get creative with how to make the most attractive buffer yard. So I really like the change we're making here.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks. Anything?
No, I mean, I agree with Eric. I mean, and frankly, I think it helps with the amount of trees and the aesthetics for a development actually looking like a development a lot sooner than having to wait 15 years for tiny little things to grow. So I think it's a good.
Lisa? Okay. Tom?
I'm good.
Wendy?
Nope.
Okay, good.
That's all the
That's
amendments
all.
we have.
Okay. Are we voting on this as a packet?
Yep.
A package?
Yep.
Okay. So anything else, staff, that you need to add?
The only thing is when you vote on this, the recommendation that we add in language for buffering to county developments or county property.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna ask Lisa to make, we need a motion on business item 6A land use code amendment number 12. And since she's written this down, I'll ask her if she'd be so kind as to make that motion and state the condition that staff would like to see added to this.
I move that we approve land use code amendment number 12 with the recommendation that staff add in language that creates and establishes a buffer type for town properties that border county properties.
That works.
Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Tom seconded. Okay, all in favor of business item 6A land use code amendment number 12 with the condition as stated by Lisa? Say aye.
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 Opposed? Passes on a 5-0 vote. Thank you, everybody.
I would just
Lisa?
like to state, thanks for going through and explaining all this, because I think there's a lot of this that is pretty complicating, and it's very easy to think that, you know, why is this happening? Why is this, what is the reasoning behind this? So appreciate your time in explaining it. It's very helpful.
Good. Reports, Eric, you still with us?
I'm here, and I just want to thank everybody for time we spent together on the commission. I take leaving my seat there pretty seriously. I really wish it wasn't something I had to do, but I think it is the responsible thing for me to do. So it's been a pleasure serving with everybody on the commission. Thank you.
You will be missed.
You will be missed for sure. And I know you're doing the right thing. This is for your family, but we will miss you. So
I appreciate that and appreciate the kind words earlier as well, Phil. Thank you, Lisa.
we'll find a suitable way to, when you're around, to acknowledge your contributions. Anything else by way of reports, commissioners,
No,
staff?
I don't have anything necessarily to add, but I do want to thank you for going through this with us, this land use code amendments. Just know that it takes a lot of staff time where we diligently review this. All of us, Natalie, Chad, Kevin, and myself, we go through all these things and try to vet them as best we can. And your input on these is important to us because it gives us, it kind of checks us too. So because we can get kind of focused on some of this and we want to make sure we're doing the right thing for the community. And that's why you're here. So you can give us good guidance and make sure we're on the right path. So thank you for that. And I will echo what Phil said. Eric, you'll be missed and we appreciate your time that you've given to the town as a volunteer on this board. It really does mean a lot to all of us and it's invaluable and everybody's service is invaluable and we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you,
Marty,
Matt.
Marty, you still there?
yes,
Okay, thanks a lot for doing this too. I appreciate you, especially, I had a feeling you would read up on this stuff. And that was very helpful and appreciate you especially doing it, given the circumstances and the distance, to say the least. So thanks and safe travels to you.
you're welcome.
Anything else, commissioners? Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Oh, hold on, Phil.
Yeah.
One thing I would, the lights went out. One thing I would, before you ask that, I would just recommend that Eric be the one to motion to adjourn.
Appreciate that, Marty.
That seems appropriate. Eric, would you like to make a motion to adjourn?
I would like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting tonight.
Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second. All in favor of Eric's motion to adjourn? Very good, Marty. Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed? Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
Yeah.